Kremlin realizes that in their information campaigns that they can manipulate populations. I see too many Americans that don't know the history. They just sit and listen passively, and then they're easily manipulated. I want Americans to understand when the Russians claim that they won single-handedly, the Second World War. They defeated Nazi Germany. That is not a true narrative. We all fought against that evil together. He wants to create this recreation of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, justifying a war against Ukraine, where you're bombing schools, you're bombing hospitals, you're kidnapping children. What we care about is in 1991, Ukraine was established as an independent state.
Professor Corn, I'm so pleased to welcome you back to our second podcast. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing knowledges with us today, with our audience.
Thank you for having me back, and thank you for your team, especially Yulia, for organizing this. I know it's not easy to set up a podcast like this. And thank you to the hosts for having us in this wonderful facility, which is pretty amazing. A hidden gem in Washington, D.C.
And we really appreciate your time to talk about very important topic about the Russian disinformation, the continuation of this kind of podcast. And today we are going to talk about your recent article that you published about the Kremlin's lies about the World War II. So the name of your article, The Forgotten History Moscow Doesn't Want Remembered. There you argued that the Moscow doesn't really simply remember the history, but actively curates it, distorts, and weaponize it. So why do you think is historical memory such important topic for the Kremlin today?
Well, because I think that the Kremlin realizes that in their information campaigns that they can manipulate populations, they can create the conditions for their information warfare by misrepresenting certain parts of history. And when the audiences that they're speaking to or communicating to don't really know the history, it's very easy to manipulate them. So the article I wrote was based on my years of seeing how Russia, so the Soviet Union and then Russia, presented the history of the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia and many parts of the former Soviet Union, or the Second World War, as we call it, and how they distorted over the years different aspects of that terrible conflict. And in the 90s, I saw that the Russians actually were much more honest about the war and the contributions made by their allies. We know that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of discussion about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin's decision to ally himself with Adolf Hitler and fascist Germany from 1939 until 1941, when Hitler deceived him and invaded the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of talk in the 90s and a lot of appreciation for what the United States did through the Lend-Lease program and other aspects of our assistance to the Soviet Union. That has gone away starting in the early 2000s with Vladimir Putin's rewriting of history, not just about the Second World War, but many parts of history. And I think it's all designed to promote this image that Russia is surrounded, it's isolated, that nobody has helped Russia, that the West is against Russia. And I think that line of reasoning has been used to manipulate the Russian people themselves into justifying Putin's policies of controlling them, denying them access to the West, trying to reassert, rebuild the Iron Curtain that existed before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and scare people into thinking that they have to accept Putin and his policies, when in fact those policies aren't serving their interests. They're serving the interests of a small group of people in the Kremlin. So it's very frustrating to see because, again, in the 90s, I saw and I heard and I spoke with many, many Russians who recognized and appreciated the cooperation we had during the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War. What bothers me as an American is to see how they denigrate the contributions made by our country and by other allies. And I want to be clear, I wrote this in the article, we should never, never forget the suffering that the people in Russia or the former Soviet Union went through during that war. But there are many other people in Europe that suffered greatly, and there were many sacrifices made, and we should respect all of those sacrifices. So that's why I wrote the article. And I want Americans to understand, and people in the West, some of the other arguments that should be made when the Russians claim that they won single-handedly the Second World War. They defeated Nazi Germany. That is not a true narrative, in my opinion. It's not historically correct.
So you described that Russia's manipulation of World War II history is part of propaganda and basically cognitive warfare. So in your opinion, how should the Western policymakers think about the security risks that arise when history becomes part of the modern information warfare?
Well, I think this is something that's very important. I'll just speak in the United States, and as someone who's involved in educating young Americans, we need to do a better job teaching history and making sure that people in our country understand the history. Again, if you're being presented with information where you have no real depth of knowledge of the issue, it's very easy to be manipulated. When you know the facts, when you know what happened actually, we'll just use the example of the Second World War, you can then sometimes push back and think critically about what you're being presented with in a propaganda campaign, in a cognitive warfare campaign. And so that's one of the reasons I wrote the article. We need to do a better job in the United States of educating people, educating young people and older people and policymakers about what the real facts were. So when the Russians argued to them that we single-handedly won the war, we suffered, we bore the brunt of the German, the Nazi aggression, we need to be able to push back and say, well, actually, there's some facts here that you need to understand from our perspective that are very important for you to understand, that you paid a great price, but so did we, and so did other allies, and that we all fought against that evil together, right? When you do that, my experience with the Russians is when you're capable of doing that, they actually respect it, and they kind of want it. Unfortunately, over and over again, I see too many Americans that don't know the history, and they just sit and listen passively, and then they're easily manipulated. And I don't like that.
That's true. The people who don't know the history, it's very easy to really be manipulated. Here's the next question I would like to raise, but you basically already kind of covered that, but maybe you have something to add. So the central point in your article is that the Kremlin promotes the image of Russia, that they're the one who basically sole victor over Nazism. So what do you think, what's the strategic purpose does that narrative serve in today's Russia?
Again, I think part of it is to scare people to think that they can be victimized by another aggression and they're surrounded by enemies. They only can rely on the Kremlin to protect them. That makes the Russian population itself more passive or more manipulable, controllable. I think they try to do this to other countries too, to try and improve the image of Russia, right? And that's a whole nother part of their foreign policy objectives, soft power, through the presentation of history in a way that's very favorable to Russia, and that doesn't present actually some of the facts that were not very pretty, right? And of course, one of the reasons I wrote the article too is because we know, we're talking about Ukraine, the Russians continue to present this narrative that the Ukrainians sided with the Nazis, the fascists, that they are fascists, and this gives Russia the right to invade and try and reconquer Ukraine. They make the same argument about the Baltic states. But what they fail to mention as part of the historical discourse on this very complicated issue is that actually, again, Stalin signed an agreement with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He divided Poland and parts of Romania, so he made a land grab, together with the Nazis. And you can find pictures of the Gestapo and the NKVD meeting and marching together, celebrating in parts of Poland when they were arresting Polish citizens. We don't ever hear about, and most Americans have never heard of Vlasov's army, General Vlasov, who went over to the side when he was captured by the Germans in 1943. He volunteered to create an all-Russian, for the volunteer army, in Vlasov's army, made up primarily of Russian POWs, and he did. The Germans armed them, and they were fighting against the Allies. Hitler was very reticent to let them fight against the Soviet Union itself because he didn't trust them completely, but they were fighting in the Balkans. They were fighting on the Western Front. And, there probably, you could look at historically, there were more Russians that sided with the fascists than there were Ukrainians. And of course, even before the war, many of the white Russians that left Russia after the collapse of the Tsar's regime, and then after the horrible civil war, many that fled and into exile, some of them sided with Germany, and they wanted to help the fascists. And why did they want to do that? Because they wanted to remove the Bolshevik regime. They wanted to remove the communists who had stolen their country from them, right? And if we turn back to the Ukrainians, many of the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, why did they side with the Germans originally? Because they thought that they were helping them liberate them from Stalin and the aggressive, oppressive regime that was destroying their cultures, destroying their languages, imposing their will by force and by terror on them. So they saw an alternative, and I think many probably later regretted. The Germans, the way that they behaved was just as bad as Stalin. But if you took a look at this historically, you can understand why many Ukrainians welcomed the Germans when they came as liberators, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, right? And it doesn't justify any of those people that were involved in anti-Semitic acts, that were involved in executing, minorities. But it's understandable politically why people may have been motivated to welcome a invading army as liberators if you understood the conditions of the Soviet Union and what happened historically up to that point. It didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? When the Soviet Union was created, they used force and terror to assert control over all of the republics, all of the parts of the former Russian Empire to reassert control. And they terrorized people. We know about the Holodomor. We know about the policies they had towards ethnic minorities, the Chechens, the Meshekinsi Turks in the Caucasus, the Crimean Tatars. We know what they did to them. And that was, in many cases, part of a terrorist campaign to assert and then maintain control from the Kremlin.
So, in your view, how does the Kremlin's use of the anti-fascist narrative function as the political weapon against Ukraine and the West? Because that's also relative nowadays.
Yes. Well, because, listen, nobody in the West, speaking of the United States, nobody should welcome fascism, right? Nobody should want fascism. What Hitler did in Germany, what Mussolini did in Italy during their reigns was horrible, right? And nobody should welcome that type of political system. And so the Russians use that because they know that there's a very, very bad memory, and the connotation, being associated with fascism is a very bad thing. So then you can use it against the Ukrainians to undermine support for Ukraine, claiming if you support Ukraine, you're supporting a fascist regime. You're supporting fascism. You're supporting fascists, right? And that is a highly exaggerated, inaccurate argument. And as some people have said, the president of Ukraine is Jewish. Would he really be a fascist? Probably not, right? If you've been to Ukraine and you spend time in Ukraine, there's a problem with ultra-right, people that you could argue are fascists. That's a very, very small minority. And actually, in comparison to Russia, where they have a much bigger problem. And if you look at the historic parallel, what I'm saying again is even during the Russian Empire and then the end of the Russian Empire, there were many people that supported fascist ideologies, right? Extremist ideologies. And there were some of those people in any country. But to argue that all of Ukraine is run by fascists, that to me is a ridiculous argument. But many people, unfortunately, in this country and in other countries believe that because they don't know the history.
Yeah, and because it's the way we saw also before, it goes like some narratives in the social media, which is spread it very fast, and then somehow this narratives comes to very big media outlets and sometimes even respected media outlets, and somehow you open the articles that basically Russian disinformation, but spread it all over in the United States or Europe. But do you see the continuity between Soviet-era historical propaganda and Putin's era historical revisionism, or has the Kremlin's approach changed in important ways?
Well, even during the Soviet time, there were different periods and different approaches to presenting this history, right? During Khrushchev's period, Brezhnev's period, during Stalin's times, there's some continuation of some of the Soviet-era propaganda, but I think it's become much worse under Vladimir Putin. And I think many of the things he's doing, I always said, I don't think he wants to create the Soviet Union. He wants to create this monster that I would call a recreation of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which is kind of this they have a lot of the symbolism. They've resurrected the Orthodox faith, and they've used that. They've weaponized that. They've used symbols from the Tsarist times to try and motivate citizens. They appeal to their patriotic feelings. And then with this kind of historic propaganda, they use a mix of arguments and for different purposes. Again, you want to undermine your enemy, let's say the Ukrainians, you want to weaken them, then you call them fascists. You want to build up the prestige of the Russian state, you claim that we single-handedly defeated the fascist Germany. As I wrote in the article, what they never talk about is they didn't do anything against Imperial Japan. They left that problem to the United States, the British, and our Australian allies, right, in the Pacific region. The United States led that campaign. The Soviets didn't declare war on Japan until the very end when we, I think, dropped our first atomic bomb. And in my assessment, that was because Stalin wanted us to fight that conflict so he could focus on other things. In fact, I talk in the article about the famous Operation Snow. It was a very, very unknown, but every American should know about this covert action operation that Stalin ordered. And the Russians brag about it. They manipulated Japan and the United States into a war, into going to war. And if you put yourself in Stalin's shoes, you can understand why he did it, because he thought it was good for the Soviet Union. But if you do that, and then you don't contribute to the effort in the Pacific, then don't claim you won the war single-handedly. If we had not fought with Japan in the Pacific, he could not have moved, I think it was 44 divisions, I may get that wrong, from the Far East military district and Siberian military district to Moscow to stabilize the Moscow front when the Germans were, I think, maybe 30 kilometers. They said the German troops could see the spires of the Kremlin. I've actually been to the spot outside of Moscow where you can see the Kremlin, and that's where the Germans reached. And I won't go into all the detail here, but
no, if you want to, you can.
It's important to know that Operation Snow was an operation designed to manipulate the United States and Japan to go into war, because Stalin was afraid that the Japanese were going to invade the Soviet Union, and he couldn't fight a two-front war. The history of how he found out that the Japanese were not going to invade the Soviet Union is fascinating, but the fact is that if we had not fought the Japanese, he would have had to contend with that problem. And so we did. And there were many Americans that died and fought in the Pacific, Australians, Brits, and they shouldn't be forgotten. They shouldn't be disrespected. And I think a lot of Putin's propaganda today is simply disrespectful, and that is shameful to me.
And how does the manipulation of World War II memory help the Kremlin create more legitimacy for authoritarian rule inside Russia? So how does it really help?
Great question. I mean, what I've seen since Putin's come to power, well, let's look at the 1990s. In the 1990s in Russia, there was a lot of chaos and disorder, right? And I think people were scared, people were worried. The transition to a market economy, transition to democracy didn't go well in the 90s, probably because it was rushed and it wasn't organic to the Russian political mindset. I think people in the West made the mistake of assuming that they could just impose some of the system in the U.S. or in Europe on the Russians. That was a big mistake, my opinion. But then as a reaction to that, people got scared, and then guys like Putin came along and said, we can bring stability and order, and in return, you have to give up your freedom. And unfortunately, I remember Russians saying in the late 90s, we're willing to give up our freedom of speech. We're giving because we want security, we want safety. One gentleman told me once, listen, I want the ability to read whatever I want or say whatever I want or write whatever I want, but I'd rather have my daughter be able to walk down the street without being raped. And so that was what they were facing. There was a lot of instability. And of course, the Kremlin has used that fear consistently over the last 20 plus years to remind Russians all the time that the choice you made, the contract you had was, you give me power, absolute power, I bring you stability and prestige. I'm going to make you a great power again. Right? We're not on our knees anymore. We're standing up, and the world's going to have to contend with us. And my argument is until probably about 2012, 13, Putin gave that to Russia, and he deserves credit. But after 2014, his invasion of Ukraine, the start of the war in Ukraine, it started to backfire on him. And today, Russia is not better off, but worse off as a result. We just saw the Ukrainians just hit a oil terminal outside of Moscow. We saw during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum that they hit targets outside of St. Petersburg. We know crime is on the rise in Russia. We know these veterans are going home. There's a big problem, social problems in Russia. Funding for social services has been cut to fund the war machine. Russia is no better off today than it was in I'd argue 1999. And in fact, it's probably worse. And the people don't have their rights. And so at some point, I would hope that the Russian people realize that the contract they signed it hasn't been upheld by the Kremlin, and they needed an alternative contract with a new authority, because I don't think Putin has delivered the promises. You talk about cognitive warfare. There were, in the 2018 Duma elections, when Putin wanted a big turnout, or presidential elections, he wanted a big turnout. I think he knew he was going to win because there was no alternative, right? The Russian opposition was divided, broken, and they were never going to let anyone else win. But there was a video that went around on social media, which everybody should watch this video. It was put out by the pro-Putin folks, and it appealed to every fear that Russians had. And I won't go into the whole detail on the video, but it basically, they look psychologically, what scares Russians? And then in this video, they hit those themes in this video to motivate people to go vote, right? And it was, they played upon their fear of ethnic minorities. They played upon their fears about homosexuality. They played upon their fears of the influence of Western culture, which, they've promoted as being this radical, left-wing, insane, liberal values which undermine traditional Russian values. And they did that very effectively. And it probably helped them get more people out to vote, because they were scared that if we don't vote for Putin again, we're going to have the alternative. And, the alternative they think is the only alternative is this insane liberalism, this globalist order, which, many Russians are afraid of. And unfortunately, today we see that in the West too. Many people are afraid of that. They're not happy with it. And so their propaganda also plays on that fear in the West, in this country. They manipulate people as presenting Russia as the homeland of true traditional values, right? When you go to Moscow a couple of years ago and you see all over, they have this ZOJ. ZOJ? Здоровый образ жизни, right? They like this healthy lifestyle, and it's traditional family values. And okay, great, but is that really the truth? I don't think so, right? If you look behind the facade, there's a lot of... It's
probably the truth only when somebody presented you this picture, but if you yourself can go also to the social media and see the regular videos of people inside that country, like you'll see very different style of living and stuff, like everywhere.
Yes,
so
like
it's
everywhere.
Not, it's just a picture that is they're trying to present.
And conservatives in the U.S. should not be mistaken and think that the Kremlin represents traditional values that they grew up on here in the United States. Far from it. Mm-hmm. Far from it.
And also you mentioned fear, and I think it's really important also to talk about that so people understand, one hand, it's like very obviously that the fear, like once you feel fear, it's very easy to manipulate you. But at the same time, when the situation comes and you really hear those, articles or any narratives, and you really feel this fear, and you forgot about everything, and you really go and you manipulate it, you go, you vote, and or whatever they need from you. And I think it's very important to explain to people how does it work. By the fear that was always for centuries. That's the exact feelings by which you're very much easy to manipulate.
Right. Yeah.
Also, your article suggests that distorted history is not just misinformation about the past, but a mechanism for shaping present political behavior. So how does that process work basically psychologically and socially?
Again, I think that if you can create the impression or build this foundation, like false foundation in the conscious or subconscious of your audience, then you can manipulate that very easily, and then you can build upon that false foundation, right? You can build upon the lies, because your target audience doesn't know the alternative truth. They don't know. They don't have anything to counter that with, and so they accept it as being true. And then over time, some people claim that they give credit to Lenin for the saying, I don't know if it's true or not, but a lie told enough times becomes the truth, right? If people keep hearing this lie and then they go, okay, it's true, it must be true, right? In this case, the U.S., because one of the narratives that the Kremlin is presenting is that not only did the Soviet Union take on Germany alone, but actually the British, the Americans deliberately allowed the Germans to, kill millions of Russians, that we were actually secretly working with the Nazis. I saw a video on YouTube, a Russian video, that made the insane, absurd argument that the Blitz, the German bombing of London, which was horrific, was actually all propaganda, that the British bombed themselves to create the impression that they were fighting the Germans. But in fact, they weren't. They were in cahoots with the Germans, and that only the Soviet Union was fighting against fascist Germany. That's insane, right? That's absurd. And then I think one of the other things with this history is they also want to create a lot of confusion, because it goes back to the fear thing. When people get confused and they don't know what to believe, they just become passive and they give up. I've heard people say that, like, everything is so confusing today, I just don't care anymore. I saw that with Russians. They would say, like, we don't have a voice. People would tell me, I know that what's being promoted by the Kremlin is false, but I don't trust anything else anyway, so I just don't care anymore. I don't pay attention. I just focus on my agorod, I just focus on my music, I focus on my, whatever literature I'm allowed to read, and I just try and survive, right? Which is also dangerous, especially in the United States, we can't allow that to happen, because if you're a democracy, people have to be actively engaged, and they can't feel like they have no voice, they have no ability to influence things. They do. It's not easy, but they do. But the Kremlin wants them to believe today you don't. Not just the Kremlin. Beijing, other forces want Americans and Europeans now to think that we can't influence anything anyway, so don't care. Just become passive.
And it's also one of the way.
Yes, yes. And then you become basically like a sheep, and you can be herded. Right? But Americans aren't sheep, we're eagles.
And actually, now you also remind me with that example with the Great Britain. Just a couple of days ago, I also did an interview with the former ambassador Herbst, and he also was mentioning the situation that happened in Donbass, in east of Ukraine. But that's kind of like the same narrative that was spreaded from Kremlin to the West, to the international audience, that the problem in Donbass since 2014, it's an inside problem. It's that they are themselves bombing or doing so. It's a civil conflict. It's not the directed operation from Russia. And then he also explained the way it's actually, those who were become, let us say, presidents of Donbass and stuff, that was people from FSB, and their background is very easy, and they're to check and see that they are from Russia. So that's not an...
Americans like Ambassador John Herbst are dangerous to the Kremlin because they know the history. They worked in the region for years. They know the history, right? If you listen to him speak, he can lay out the history of all these issues, and the Kremlin can't. I've seen him, I ran into him recently at an event, and I told him, I said, I saw him on Russian TV a couple of years ago. This is before the full-scale invasion. He was on one of these Telemost shows, and the Russians made a comment about Ukraine, and they said, they kept saying, "Na Ukraine," and he said, he kept saying Ukraine, right? And so they tried to lecture him, and he pushed back on him hard. He said, "Don't lecture me on how this is the way the Ukrainians presented. This is why they don't say Na Ukraine, and you need to respect them." Just like everyone should respect you. You want to say vrasi, vrasi. Like no one's going to say narasi, right? But you can't, what gives you the right? And don't lecture me on how to speak when it comes to the Ukraine. Now, this was the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He knows the history of Ukraine. So God bless people like Americans like John Herbst. And more Americans should listen to him because he was there. He saw it. Right? Those of us who live in that part of the world, work in that part of the world, you get to know the history kind of up close and personal. And if going back to Donbass, yes, the Russians create this false narrative, and then they use it. And unfortunately, people in the United States say things like, "Oh, Donbass was part of Russia anyway." they're Russians anyway, it should be part of Russia anyway. Well, then does that argue that people in Brooklyn that are Russian speakers, that should be part of Russia? No, I'm from New York. I'm never giving up Brooklyn. It's a beautiful place. Never going to surrender it to Russia. Does that mean that, because there's an ethnic Russian population in a country that gives the Kremlin right to take over that country? No, it doesn't. And I would say that if you look at the history of the Donbass, we know that during the Civil War, the Donbass actually tried to declare independence from Russia, the Don Cossacks, and Ukraine. They created an independent republic for a while. It didn't last very long, but they declared they didn't want to be part of Russia, right? The same with the Kuban. The Kuban, like there was a Kuban republic. Most Americans don't even know that. But when the Russians used to argue to me, oh, it's part of Russia, I say, no, it's actually Crimea. Crimea was never part of Russia, right? It was a Khanate, right? It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was not part of Russia. So the Russians conquered it, they occupied it, and then they tried to get rid of the Crimea population. They replaced them with Ukrainians and Russians. Now they're trying to get rid of the Ukrainians and claim it was part of Russia historically. That's an absurd argument, right? That means that that the British have the right to say that the 13 colonies were part of England. They can take them back. No, right? Luckily, the British don't make that argument. But the Russians still make that insane argument. And some people here, unfortunately, buy into it because they don't know the history.
I also had one thought that we discussed, what you mentioned previously about na Ukraine and в Ukraine. So maybe just for the audience, we can explain a little bit, for the American audience. So, right, so like na Ukraine, so like on Ukraine, right? And in в Ukraine, it's in Ukraine.
Well, so my understanding is the Russians make this argument that it kind of like it's on the edge. It was the edge of the empire. Yes. So it means it's part of the empire, right? But what they ignore is the fact that in the Ukrainian language, kind of means country, right? Land. It doesn't mean the edge. So the Russians interpret it in Russian language, and they try and argue that this was part, like the Ukraine was part of the edge of our empire. So it's we have a right to call it our empire, right? And linguistically, it may seem silly, but I agree with the Ukrainians. No, it's in our country, Ukraine, right? Anyway, so most Americans will know. It's hard to understand without knowing the languages, but it's an important point. Yes. And I heard a very senior official recently say in a discussion, well, doesn't it mean on the edge? Because he knows Russian. But I was with the Ukrainian-American scholar, and he told him, no, he just made the argument. He said, that's not in Ukrainian what it means. You need to understand Ukrainian.
Yes, that's true. And it's so much related just for also understanding for the sovereignty of the country. So regarding this disinformation, or specifically like about the history, so in your view, why are democratic societies often slow to respond to historical disinformation, even when it's directly affected national security?
Well, one, we have a big challenge because how do you control information in a democratic society, right? You have freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Personally, I think I said this in the last podcast, I do not support those Americans that claim that we have to have some censorship. I think that's a bad idea, right? And in most democratic societies, you don't have a body or an organ like that controls information like you have in dictatorships, right? And then, what does Putin has the advantage? Xi Jinping has the advantage of what we call like a whole of government approach to everything. The Russian propaganda machine, it includes the intelligence services, it includes the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it includes the radio and television, like now internet. Everything is designed to support the Kremlin's narrative, right? In the United States, we don't have that. Even sometimes you have the State Department saying one thing, the Department of War saying another thing. Of course, you have free media, people saying what they want, and there's often like a lack of unity in messaging. In crises or in times of war, I've seen that messaging come together and be very effective. During the Cold War, under Ronald Reagan's administration, he realized we had to do a better job of bringing expertise together and coordinating within the federal government, identifying propaganda and then countering it, right? And he built a mechanism to do that. But that was very rare. It doesn't exist today. as far as I know. I don't see it anymore. I didn't see it in my career after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That capability was disbanded, unfortunately. But the last thing is, like, as an American, I don't want anyone telling me what I can read or what I can, what information I'm allowed to have access to. I don't think that censorship is the answer. I think education is the answer. And unfortunately, in my opinion, we've allowed the level of education to deteriorate in the United States. And it's probably the same in Western Europe, in some democratic countries. And that was mistaken. Some basic skills have been allowed to atrophy, including the most important, critical thinking. We don't demand critical thinking from young people as we educate them, and we've got to fix that. That's the best response to propaganda, in my opinion.
What do you think, what should the United States and Europe do probably differently to counter Russian historical revisionism?
Well, again, going back to my comments about education, we need to probably we need to invest more in basic education. We need to probably change some of the way that we approach education. Personally, like what I've seen in recent years in the U.S. is there's this, like, we don't encourage critical thinking, but we often attack people that think critically, right? We want this monolithic, everyone must say certain things. Some people call it wokeness. People were being attacked if they would say things that were contrary to maybe the opinions of some other people. We need to be a little bit, this is one of the examples I see with Ukraine all the time, is resilient. We need to teach young people that if someone doesn't agree with you and they criticize you, you shouldn't just fold or start crying or complaining. You should, argue with them back why you don't agree with them, but do it respectfully, right? Don't try and cancel people. That's just as bad as censorship. We need to encourage people across the country to listen to each other. We need to encourage people not to, I tell people all the time, you'll see information on social media that is designed to appeal to your emotions. Mm-hmm. You become passionate about something, emotional about something. Take a deep breath, ask yourself, it happens to me all the time. I see something, I feel the emotion. Then you have to say, wait a minute. Let me go do a little research. What is this really about? What does this really mean? Like, where's this coming from? Where's the information coming from? And often you find out that you're just being manipulated. Don't let yourselves be manipulated. Don't respond immediately. Don't repost stuff. I see this all the time. People reposting stuff, they don't even know if it's true or not. They just repost it. No, this. And when you ask them, you just sent me this link to something. Did you listen to it? You know the history here? No, but I was like, I don't like this. Okay, but it actually happened, right? We see this all the time. People make claims that are false claims, and they get spread around. It goes back to that statement about Lenin, a lie told enough times just becomes the truth. And you don't want lies that become truth.
True. And like you said last time, that when people repost and they basically gain a lot of like thousands, 100,000 views, and then it becomes like a next step is that people already who see this 100,000 views, they see only those numbers and they say, that might be the truth.
Yeah.
Just because it has like a lot of views.
A lot of people are following this.
Yeah.
And even more dangerous is when people that have influence, that have some position in society of influence, when they repost it, then people say, this general reposted it, must be true. This former senator or this congressman, whatever, right? This movie star reposted it. That must be true. Well, no.
It's true if you check the facts.
Right.
And whoever is reposting, whoever is posting it, you should see the facts.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how well educated is that person that's reposting it? What do they really know about the issue? What research have they done? Right? Mm-hmm. But people are just seeing stuff emotionally, they repost it, and it can be very damaging.
Yeah, and we see already how is it damaging and how is it influenced people's opinions and their actions, because it's all like have cause and effect. There is nothing like, and then we see how people start going against each other and so on and so forth. Actually, I don't know if you know that fact, but just recently I saw the article that's very interesting. How does it work? So it was happening in France and also in Germany. So there was a Russian operation that was already proved. There was a court case and so on. They used Serbian people who did on the religious field. So they they tried to go against, make against each other the Jewish people and Muslim people inside France. So basically, they did some very vandalism things with the synagogues, and then after a while, they did some horrible things with the mosque. Basically, point to each other, kind of like that Muslim people did it to Jewish people, and then Jewish people respond to Muslim people. But in the reality, that was never ever part of that groups. And then when there was a Kurd already, so those Serbian people, they basically said, yes, we're guilty. So they basically accepted, and they found Russian funds behind it directly from the Kremlin, which is showing us very examples how they might use very different tools, because we're talking about the cognitive warfare, but in a way we see also the stuff in the social media as well with the religious communities and other groups of people that they're trying to make against each other. And I think it's so much related to learn and to understand that you don't have to, even you see this in the social media, you don't have to believe it first, and you need to really see who's behind that. It's hard with such cases, I think, because you have to prove. I mean, with the Kurd case, you have to have proofs, but still.
You bring up a great point. You should know that there are cases like this that should demonstrate that one group or one party is using that type of mechanism to inflame emotions, to divide communities, right? The reason they're doing this is because they understand that if they can divide, we'll just use the case of America, if they can divide America into small groups that are warring with each other all the time, then one, it's not a threat to Russia and Putin's power. And two, then they can assert control and dominate without ever going to have to go to real war, right? It's only information war. Your enemy is so weak because they can't get along. The enemy's forces can't unify and resist, so they just basically surrender. That's the goal, right? And it's not just with the Russians, but some of our other enemies. It's a way of waging warfare. And so Americans should think, and you bring up this case, we had the case in Texas where they were doing that, trying to instigate tension between a Muslim community and a Christian community in Texas. They did the same type of thing. They did this in New York in the 1970s. They tried to instigate warfare, tension, or violence between the Jewish community and the African American community. They knew that there are sensitivities there, and they play on those sensitivities. They try to exaggerate or pour fuel on the spark of some kind of tension. And if you know that, then maybe when you start getting emotional and angry about something, you can think and say, maybe I'm being manipulated. Is the guy across the street really my enemy? Does he really hate me that much? And in many cases, if you go walk across the street and say, hey, you're a Muslim, I'm a Christian, or I'm Jewish, you're a Muslim, do we really hate each other that much? Oftentimes you'll find out you have a lot more in common, and you don't hate each other, but someone is trying to make you hate each other. This type of warfare didn't start with the Russians, but they have perfected it in many ways.
That's exactly what we also discussed a couple of days ago. They did not create it, but they use this weak points, and they're looking for the weak points to basically make that happen. And that reminds me again the George Kennan's telegram, a long telegram that basically he was explaining that the Moscow will look for already existed weak points, and that we have to understand that and basically make the America stronger. So that's the key message was about that. But usually also people thinking, that's what I agree, thinking that they might create something. No, they did not. They see already where is the weaknesses, and they might use it in a way for their narrative.
The one example is very clear example was Operation Infection, when they knew there was sensitivity about the AIDS epidemic in the United States. They knew there were some Americans that were very concerned, and they had this view that maybe the government had created this to undermine the gay community or the homosexual community. And that was a fact. There were people that were promoting that idea internally in the United States, small, fringe. But then the Soviets picked up on that, and they started amplifying that, using it, and spreading the idea that the United States government created AIDS to undermine its own population, to undermine African populations, to undermine other countries. And it was a very effective operation for years, unfortunately. So for any piece of propaganda, there has to be like a kernel of truth, maybe, that then can be manipulated, right? And unfortunately today, there's too many little kernels of truth that are out there that can be manipulated, and with social media, it can be done very quickly. So
yeah, that's the tool that we have nowadays. That's why it's become like so even faster sometimes to spread the new narratives. If we talk about the right to countering the disinformation, so what warning signs should analysts look for when the historical narratives are being converted into justification of aggressions, basically repression or foreign influence operations?
Well, again, I think it goes back, you have to know the history, right? You have to start to see when an adversary is promoting a certain narrative historically, are they justifying, are they getting ready to use that to justify an aggressive act against another country, against another community? If you can see that and cut it off early, maybe you can counter it, and then you can deny them that justification, right? So in the case of Ukraine, when they were promoting a lot of this, Ukraine is fascist country, fascists run it, what was it, Pravi sector, they control everything. Maybe if we had been faster and better and understanding what was going on, and then countered that, maybe we would have undermined their ability to justify the full-scale invasion. Maybe, maybe not. But it would have made it a lot harder for them to justify it, because unfortunately, I think some people in the West believe, well, maybe there is a real reason why they need to do this. And then, of course, inside of Russia itself, I think we need to do a better job of countering all these false narratives, because I've said over and over again, the Russians are not the American people are not the enemy of the Russian people. Most Americans don't want war with Russia. They don't want to see Russians suffer. They'd like to have a good relationship with Russia, and they're not threatening Russia. I was in the government for 34 years. I never saw a plan to invade Russia or to destroy Russia. In fact, I wrote an article a couple of years ago about all the assistance we've given Russia over the years. We gave the Russians a lot of assistance. We kept Russia from going into default or collapsing in the 1990s, early 2000s. Our aid programs to Russia continued probably until 2012 or 13, maybe even 14. So the goal of the United States was not to destroy Russia. Putin promotes this narrative, again, to scare people and to motivate them to hate the United States, to hate Americans. And we shouldn't let that happen, right? Now, one of the tragedies of the situation today is that there's no exchange anymore, right? There's no... Many Russians I met in my career that had actually traveled to the United States, had contact with Americans, really liked America. They loved America. They would say great things about America. They realized the Americans were not the enemy. We were meeting, I'm going to go on too long, but we were meeting last year with a Ukrainian official, I won't name him, but very kind of senior guy, and he told us the story about how he was raised in the Soviet Union. His father was an officer in the Soviet Air Force, and he was raised to hate America. America was the aggressor. America was the evil country that was going to destroy the Soviet Union. And he said when he was in high school, he got on an exchange program and came to the United States for a couple of weeks, and he went back and he told his father, "You're a liar. You lied to me. These people don't hate us." And he says his father said, "No, it was a Potemkin village, Pakazuka, ani obmanuli tibia." And then he said eventually he brought his father to the United States, and his father came to him one day and said he was here for a couple of months, and he said, "You're right, I was wrong," right? The Americans they don't hate us. They don't want to destroy the world. They don't want to destroy us. They're just like us, right? They're human beings. And I saw that over and over again in my career living in Russia or other parts of the former Soviet Union. Americans are not that much different, right? We may have some different values, but from the common Russian, we're not. The common Russian allows a small group of people to manipulate them to support their insane policies, like justifying a war against Ukraine, where you're bombing schools, you're bombing hospitals, you're kidnapping children. Then, we shouldn't have anything in common with that. But before all this, I saw that we had a lot in common. And we're not the enemy of the Russian people. And I don't think we've done a good enough job of messaging that. After this full-scale invasion, Arnold Schwarzenegger did a great, I don't know if you remember this video he did, appeal to the Russian people, which it was a great, great job. Unfortunately, he was no longer the governor. He was no longer in a position of political power. Nobody else tried to make that message, which was really a mistake. Ronald Reagan, who was the great communicator, figured out that he could communicate to the Soviet people, and he was very effective about it. And many Russians that to this day remember Reagan fondly, because his message was, I'm not your enemy, right? I don't want a war. We don't hate you. We don't like your political system. We don't agree with it. But you as people, like, we don't want a conflict, and we just want to live in peace with you and actually make your lives better. And we think making your lives better, like the United States is open to doing that. So we need to make that message to Russia more, in my opinion.
So here I have our final question for today's podcast. If we talk about, again, your article and everything you mentioned. So Russia today is basically actively trying to reshape a global narrative about World War II and present its own version of that history to international audiences. And in your view, what is the most important, probably historical fact or truth that American audiences should remember so that this narrative cannot be distorted or shifted?
What, the most important fact?
Yeah.
Well, the most important fact is in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated, Russia agreed with the creation of an independent Ukrainian state along the borders of that time in 1991, right? And then later, Russia signed on to an agreement to, when Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, they agreed in the Budapest Memorandum to not only respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, but to help protect it. And of course, they violated all of those agreements. Whenever you hear Russians make the claim that Ukraine is actually part of Russia, or Donbass was really historically Russian, or Crimea, we should say, no, we don't care about that. What we care about is in 1991, Ukraine was established as an independent state. Your government agreed to it, and you violated that agreement, right? We're not going to start allowing you to redraw borders based on your whim or your desire after 20 years to justify that again, because that means that any country could claim, Spain could claim that Florida was part of Spain, and so they have a right to take, right? Anybody. So we need to be disciplined about that, right? And this goes, maybe it's counter history, but whatever the history is, in 1991, Ukraine was established as an independent country. We need to respect that and those borders.
If we talk about the fact about the World War II, maybe some other things that you want to mention, important for America.
Yeah, for Americans. Again, the Pacific, the Soviets Stalin did not only enter the war to help us in the Pacific, but he actually instigated a war between the United States and Japan. That's an important thing to remember. Lend-Lease was an incredible program. Many Americans died, many allies died, moving, the maritime route in the north was very dangerous. They were torpedoed. Many of our merchant marines died, supplying Russia or the Soviet Union. We shouldn't forget that the strategic air campaign against Germany, against their industry, had a real impact on the German war machine. The efforts of the Allies in North Africa, in the Balkans, in the Mediterranean, and of course in Europe itself, all those things played a huge role in destroying, like, Italy, or not Italy, but fascist Italy, Mussolini, and then fascist Germany. So we did this together with the Soviet Union. When we became allies in 1941, we helped each other, and we should remember that. We should respect those people in the Soviet Union that suffered and died. And personally, having been there and seen, you see the monuments and you see, like, the colossal number of people that died and suffered, you have to have sympathy for them and respect for them. And my last point would be, I don't think that Vladimir Putin is respecting their memories at all when he behaves like Adolf Hitler. He employs the same methods that the fascists use to assert his control over Ukraine. And when you travel around Ukraine and you see the war monuments, you often wonder, does Putin really, it's like he's spitting on the graves of all those people that died fighting against fascism. This is the ultimate form of fascism.
Thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure talk to you. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge. It's very much important nowadays to talk more, explain more, educate people. So we truly appreciate your time. maybe, I don't know, any last wording for the audience, any wishes to Americans, to Ukrainians?
No, I have a question for you. Like, what do you
Okay.
think historically? What do you think, like, Americans should understand historically
From the
about?
Ukrainian point of view?
Yeah,
Actually, I truly agree with you. I like the point because it's like you said, the manipulation works where there are no like facts, and of course, when you don't know history. And the thing about the 1991, I think it's very much whatever happens. People might not know the history, not know the whatever agreements and so on, but there is a fact. If the agreement signed in 1991, then that's it, period. If any agreements, somebody break the agreement, then whoever can do this anywhere in the world. So then what kind of world we will live in if the agreements doesn't work anymore?
right.
So that's kind of thing that I truly appreciate. And I think in a very short thing, like a manner, you mentioned it very clearly. So even people who don't know history, there is a fact.
Right.
That's it.
Right. Yeah, we have to be honest. Like, I was very fortunate to get to live in a lot of these places, and I've studied these issues for years. Not, most Americans don't have the time to do that. They're running businesses; they have things to take care of. So if you want like everyone, right? So we can't expect everyone to have that depth of knowledge. They didn't have the opportunity. But the fact is, they can look at the fact. 1991, Ukraine was established. The borders that were agreed upon then should be the borders that Russia respects. They've demonstrated they don't respect that. And I agree with you. If they are allowed to get away with that, then that means that any country can disrespect agreements, borders, and then we'll just have complete chaos.
That's true. This world, like what's the rules? So why would we have policies? Why do we have agreements? Otherwise, that's a real collapse. That's it. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for spreading the message and countering the disinformation, which is so much important.
And thank you to your team again. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me on the program.